So, I'm going to talk about A Tale in the Desert. Um, it is one of my all-time favorite MMORPGs, and I thought it would be something I could speak extemporaneously about for a couple minutes to see how this new setup works. So, Tale in the Desert takes place in ancient Egypt. You are a citizen in Egypt 4,000 years ago. And the stranger has challenged Pharaoh to prove that Egypt is the best of all possible societies. And to do this, the citizens of Egypt must prove themselves in the 7 disciplines of man. And each discipline of man had 7 tests. So as a player, you were one of these citizens, and each of these tests took the form of either a resource management challenge or a very human organizational challenge. It was not a puzzle game in the by the common understanding. You wouldn't think of it as a puzzle game. They were the kinds of puzzles that had more to do with getting people to cooperate. This was a MMORPG where you could build things in the world. And so by way of demonstration, explanation, when you first started the game, one of the very first tasks you would receive would be to make some bricks. And to do that, you'd have to run to some trees and gather some wood, and then run around on the green part of the ground, clicking the Gather Grass button, and then run around on the sand-colored part of the ground, clicking the Gather Sand button, and then I think run up to the brown part of the ground to gather mud. And then a lot of the interaction with this game was clicking through menus. So you'd click on yourself, and one of the options would be build, and you'd click on that, and it would be a brick rack. And it would use the wood to put a brick rack on the ground, and then you'd click on the brick rack and say, make bricks. And then you would have to wait 2 minutes, 3 minutes for the bricks to dry, and then you could click on it and gather the bricks. And you'd need, at the start of the game, you'd need maybe 40 of these. It'd take you 10, 20 minutes. And eventually you would need thousands upon thousands of them, and you would build automated brick-making machines. I just sort of realized in some ways this is a precursor to Minecraft, but not in a way that'll make any sense right now. In large part because what I really enjoyed in Minecraft was building automations using modded Minecraft. Anyway, so you would build things, and some of those things would be used to complete these challenges, and some of those things would be used to build other things The 7 disciplines were each broken down into 7 challenges that got progressively harder, and it was not intended that any one person would be able to complete all 7 of these. I don't think any one person ever did. If you completed one, you were doing good. That was a difficult challenge for a normal person with a job or other hobbies. I think the most I ever heard of was 2, maybe 3 at the very high end. So one of the disciplines of man was architecture, and that entire discipline was designed to basically appeal to the kinds of players that enjoyed the grind. The discipline of architecture, the very first test was to build an obelisk. And to pass the test of the obelisk, you had to build an obelisk that was 1 cubit higher than all other obelisks currently standing in Egypt, and that it had to maintain that height or that record for 1 hour longer than anyone else. And so this was very easy if you got to it fast. If you were one of the first like 3 obelisks at height 7, 8, or 9, you basically needed some wood and some bricks and I think some rope. But the amounts you needed grew exponentially, I think, either exponentially or logarithmically. Basically, once you hit the point where the curve hockey sticked, it got real expensive real fast and started to require gems and other hard to find components. So basically, if you were one of the first people to get to this, easy peasy. If you came along later, good luck. But then it would go on to several other tests, including the test of Octek's Ghost, which was to build this elaborate display shelf, basically. And it would give you these 7 gemstones or skulls or some sort of 7 things. You got 7 of the exact... Everybody who started this test got 7 of whatever their assigned gem was. And then not only did you have to build this thing, but you had to find people who had something you needed and needed what you had, trade for all 7 of the gems or skulls that you needed, and then put them on display. And then you'd pass the test of Octek's Ghost. The discipline of body was kind of the social one. It was intended to be, well, that one's difficult. Some parts of it were social and some parts of it were very not social. I think many people would have considered the test of body to be the explorer's tests, because many of them required you to wander way off the beaten path, explore the map, understand the world, but a couple of them were social. And the interesting thing about the tests of body is that as you completed them, each of them would raise a stat. And so one of the tests of body was the tests of acrobatics. And following a pattern that might begin to sound kind of familiar, you would be given an acrobatic move when you started this test. And there were like 20 or 30 of these. And you would have to walk up next to someone and perform your move. And everyone had a like student-teacher relationship to every other player that was unknown to you and discoverable only through trial and error. And so if you were a good teacher to someone, they would learn your move in like 1 or 2 tries. And if you were a bad teacher, you could just never teach them the move. So you'd perform your move and then they'd perform their move. As you learned moves, you could then perform those moves. So if you got halfway through this and knew 10 moves and found someone you could teach, you could sit there and run through all 10 moves and they would be able to learn all 10 moves. So it was really cool. But in the sort of the early days of the game, when everybody was still trying to like get a couple moves, we'd set up the long conga lines of like 50 players, and every like minute and a half you'd advance 1 spot on the conga line and start trying to, and like if you found someone who was a good teacher, you'd write their name down so that as they learned more moves, someday you could go back to them and learn more. And I believe, I want to say this raised agility, but I don't remember what agility did mechanically in the game. Another test of body was the test of the cicada. The game would randomly spawn cicada cages basically in places where nobody went. It would determine where nobody was going, and then it would put a cicada there. And when you found 7 of them, you yourself could learn to build a cicada cage. And you basically could just locate these things by the sound. If you've ever heard a cicada, you know what that sound is. You could hear it much further away than the game would render it. So the whole goal was to be out in the middle of nowhere and listening closely. But once you built a cage, I think the challenge was to have it not be found for a certain period of time. So your goal was to find somewhere where no one would go and put your cicada cage there. There was a whole discipline of art and music. Many of the tests, in fact, I think all of them, at least to start, were actually artistic. To get started in the discipline of art and music, you had to build a sculpture. And you could do that by basically placing in 3D space any of the items that existed in the game. So I think at one point I made a man out of bales of straw as one of my tests of art and architecture, or sorry, art and music. There were the discipline of worship. This was the one that was all about people, a certain kind of people organization. One of the tests of worship was the test of the bonfire. You would build this bonfire, which was resource cheap, and then you would start it. And at the beginning, every hour it would ask for a sacrifice. And that would start to speed up. So in first hour, it'd ask for, 5 clay. And then second hour, it'd ask for, 20 sand. And then as it progressed into hour 16, 17, 18, it would start to request things, I think, every minute. And so to get a bonfire going, you needed to organize a lot of people, because you needed someone who could tend the bonfire, potentially for, in shifts. This thing would run for 24, 36 hours. You also needed a large group of people who were going to be able to procure sacrifices for the bonfire. If any of the requests ever went unfulfilled for an hour, the bonfire was over. So you had to fill them. And the way it scored was you gained points that I believe it was the number of things you sacrificed multiplied by the number of other people who sacrificed. So you could start a bonfire, give it one thing, and you'd get 0 points because no one else participated. So your goal was to get it to run as long as possible with as many people as you could find, while also maximizing your own personal contributions. And then every week the game would rank basically the top 7 highest scores, and those 7 people would pass the test. That one was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that one. But at the end of the path for all 7 disciplines, what you would have to do is build a monument. And the monument would encode a test for the next telling of A Tale in the Desert, which is something that game did very different compared to pretty much every other MMO I've ever heard of, because it was a game where you build things and you achieve things. They knew that content wouldn't last forever. You reach a point where you've done everything there is to do. So A Tale in the Desert was designed to reset. I believe the design was once every year originally, although in practice, I don't think it ever happened in a year. And this game has been out. I mean, it's still out there. You could go play this. It's changed hands a few times. The original makers sold it, and then the community has run it ever since. I want to say on Tale 8 or 9, and like I said, this is a game that came out in like 2004. So it's probably closer to 2 or 3 years per telling, but at the end of it, it would reset. And if you managed to encode a new test on a monument, then that test would replace one of the tests. And so in the next telling, people would have to do whatever that test was. They also would change how fundamental game systems worked, at least in the beginning. I think this is one of the reasons why Tales ended up lasting longer over time was I think that the game design required a lot of maintenance and upkeep from the developers. Because, in Tale 1, you'd be mining ore, you'd build a mine and then you'd click on it and then an ore cart would come out and it would just give you stuff. In Tale 2, they radically redesigned that to the system where the mine would spawn different colors and shapes of crystal, and you'd have to click on, I think, like up to 3 crystals, and then that would determine what you got out of the mine. At the end of the tale, they'd have what they called amnesty, where the developers would explain how everything the players didn't figure out worked. And they later went on to explain that the mining system in Tale 2, which I believe was universally hated, was designed to be to give you this sense of an intuitive understanding of how the ores would come out of the mine. So, there were guides. You might even still be able to find them. I haven't looked, but there were guides that would say, if you see this shape in this configuration, in this color, then click this, this, and this, and you'll get lead. And they really got down to the specifics of what you needed to do, but it wouldn't work all of the time, which drove players crazy. But sort of the design was that you would just sort of get a sense for, oh, well, if it's mostly this color, it's probably copper. And yeah, they got rid of that in Tale 3. I actually forget how it worked in Tale 3. But that's just, it's indicative of the kinds of things they would do. It would change. One of the disciplines, which I forgot entirely to talk about, was the discipline of law, I think, or politics, one of the two. But the first test of that discipline was to pass a law. And the interesting thing about laws in A Tale in the Desert is that they became encoded in the game code. So if you passed a law that said, and this is my favorite example, no one would ever do this, but it's an example of what could be done. If you passed a law that said all citizens must remain on a road at all times, they would have encoded a bounding box on the roads so that you couldn't walk off the road. That, of course, would have broken the game. No one ever would have passed that law. People wouldn't have voted on it. But it's the kind of thing they did. And there were a lot of examples of laws that basically, whenever there was a quality of life thing that the game probably should have been doing anyway, that's the kind of laws that tended to get passed. I don't have any great examples off the top of my head, but I think some of them were things like ways to report problematic players. Usually one of the first laws that would get passed was like a system like that. One of the later tests of the politics or law, I can't remember what the name of the discipline was for sure, was the test of the demi-pharaoh, which was basically a big Egypt-wide election with the person who won the election ultimately receiving the power to ban up to 3 players permanently for no reason. Which I don't know that ever actually got used. I don't remember that being used, but the idea was you wanted to make sure whoever got this power was someone you trusted to have it. And I loved the way that this game, I mean, for me, a huge part of the draw was building things. I loved building things. The stories that you sometimes hear about people that like quit their job or left school to play EverQuest. That was almost me for A Tale in the Desert. I was not capable of having a responsible relationship with this game. And so that's one of the reasons why I didn't play it a whole lot. I played in some betas. I played in the beta of Tale 1 before the game came out. And then I played for part of Tale 3, and I never played again. I think about this game probably weekly to this day, but I never played again. Because in the time that I was playing as a one-man guild, I was keeping pace with the 10, 20-man guilds, and I was doing that by never sleeping. Every single moment that I was not at work, I was playing this game. And yeah, I wouldn't say I burned out because I was having a lot of fun, but I realized there came a point where I realized I needed to stop. And so I stopped. But yeah, that's A Tale in the Desert. It's one of my favorite MMOs ever made. I spent a long time when I was still working in game development, basically. I spent a long time trying to recreate this game in different forms. I built MUDs that look a lot like this game. It's everything I want in a video game to this day.